The winter wind screamed across the Colorado plains like a wounded ghost, whipping snow through the broken timbers of what used to be a church. Charlotte Rollins stood barefoot in the ruins, her wedding dress torn and streaked with soot and blood. Smoke still curled from the ashes of the wagons behind her. The wood blackened, the canvas burnt away. There were no more hymns here, only silence. And Charlotte had learned long ago what silence meant out in the wild. Something was dead, or something was about to be. She clutched the edge of her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to fight the cold. Her breath came out in white clouds, curling into the gray sky like ghostly prayers. Behind her, 3 other women moved slowly, their steps hesitant, haunted. Mary Collins had a deep gash along her hairline, her cheeks swollen where her husband had struck her with the butt of his rifle before riding off into the frost. Lorna Ellis was missing 2 fingers. Frostbite, she'd whispered, and hadn't spoken since the fire. And Jane Lee, barely 16, walked with her arms hugging her chest, her eyes red from tears that had long since frozen on her cheeks. They had been promised new lives, promised salvation, promised they would be safe. The men they'd followed, fathers, fiancés, brothers, had spoken of a homestead, a place of peace where they could rebuild away from the filth and sin of the eastern cities. But once they were deep enough into the wild, when no law could reach them, the lies came crumbling down like the brittle beams of the church around them. "We should keep moving," Charlotte said, her voice raw from smoke and screaming. "They'll come back. Maybe not today, but they will." Mary looked at her, eyes bloodshot and wide. "With what strength? We've got no food, no horses, no coats worth the name." "We've got each other," Charlotte replied, not because she believed it would be enough, but because it was all they had left. They set out on foot, the wind driving them forward like cattle, heads bowed, boots too ruined to offer much protection. The prairie stretched endlessly, white and cruel, the sky a dome of steel. None of them asked where they were going. They didn't have a destination, just a direction, away. That night, they huddled in the hollow of a dead tree, burning scraps of canvas for warmth. Lorna finally spoke. "Do you think they planned it? To leave us here?" Mary nodded, staring into the tiny flame. "Of course they did. Men like that don't do things on accident." Charlotte said nothing, but she remembered the way Jacob had smiled when he struck her, like he'd been waiting for an excuse. Sometime after midnight, they heard it, a snort, soft and close, then the creak of saddle leather. Charlotte froze, reaching for the broken knife she'd scavenged from the wreck. The others shrank into the shadows, hearts hammering loud enough to wake the dead. A figure dismounted, boots crunching over snow. He stepped into view, tall, wrapped in furs and bearing the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to this land. His long hair was tied behind his neck, and the feathers woven into it marked him for what he was, Lakota. He looked at them without surprise, only grim understanding. His voice, when it came, was deep and deliberate. "You are not safe here." "No," Charlotte said, not lowering her knife. "We're not." More riders emerged behind him, 3, then 4, silent as shadows. They bore bows and blades, but none of them drew their weapons. One of the younger ones pointed at the burned wagons in the distance and said something in Lakota. The leader didn't look away from Charlotte. "You come with us, or you die here." "What do you want in return?" she asked, jaw tight. He tilted his head, expression unreadable. "Nothing. The land has taken enough." And something in his voice, some echo of pain or memory, made Charlotte lower her knife. They rode out before dawn, 5 women bundled in spare blankets, pressed between strangers who offered warmth but no words. As the sky lightened and the frost receded from the horizon, Charlotte looked back one last time. The church was gone. The smoke had vanished. But the fire in her chest, the one that had started when the men left them, burned brighter with every mile. By the time the sun crested over the pine-covered ridges, the women could barely hold themselves upright in the saddle. The horses moved steadily, their breaths puffing steam into the frigid air. The Lakota riders said little, but their presence was solid, unflinching, like the land itself. The lead warrior who'd spoken to Charlotte rode at the front. He hadn't given his name, nor asked for hers, but he glanced back often, eyes sharp and assessing. Not cruel, just cautious, watchful. He rode like a man who'd survived more winters than most men dreamed of, and buried more than he cared to remember. They reached the village by late morning, nestled in a shallow basin surrounded by thick forest and broken stone. Lodges dotted the snow-covered clearing, made from hides and wooden frames, smoke rising from the vents in their peaks. Children paused their play to stare. Elders watched from their thresholds. A dog barked once, then fell silent. The women were helped down from the horses. No one spoke English except the leader, and even he used it like a second blade, only when needed. Charlotte's legs buckled as her feet hit the snow. She caught herself just barely and stood tall. "We don't need charity," she told him, her voice hoarse but unbroken. He stared at her for a long moment. "This is not charity, it is choice." White Fawn, a woman with stern eyes and steady hands, stepped forward then. She gestured them into a nearby lodge where firelight glowed faintly through the stretched hides. Inside it was warm and quiet. Blankets lined the floor. A pot simmered over the coals, and the scent of herbs and meat filled the air. Mary fell asleep almost instantly. Jane cried, silently, tears trailing down her soot-streaked cheeks. Lorna simply curled into a corner and closed her eyes. Charlotte remained upright, staring into the fire. When White Fawn returned with hot tea and a bowl of stew, she set them beside Charlotte and said in careful English, "Eat. You must live before you fight." "I'm not fighting," Charlotte replied. White Fawn looked at her. "Then why do you still burn?" Outside, the village moved slowly, men sharpening blades, women tending to drying hides and weaving mats from reeds and bark. Snow fell again that afternoon, soft and lazy, like it didn't know death had come through these hills. Days passed. The women healed slowly. Sarah's fever broke. Mary's bruises faded. Lorna started speaking again, only a few words at first, but enough. Jane smiled for the first time when one of the Lakota children offered her a carved wooden bird. She traced its wings with her fingers and whispered, "It looks like the one my mama used to hang above my bed." Charlotte didn't speak much, but she watched. She learned. The Lakota didn't look at them with pity. They didn't speak in soft tones or offer hollow comfort. They simply were, fierce, present, real. On the fourth evening, the leader returned. He stepped into the lodge without asking. Charlotte stood, her spine stiffening as he entered. "My name is Chayton," he said. "You should know it if you're going to haunt my steps." Charlotte blinked. "I haven't been following you." He stepped closer, arms folded across his chest. "You watch like a hawk, you wait like a wolf, you burn like firewood that hasn't caught yet." She held his gaze. "I burn because I was left to freeze." A long silence stretched between them. Then he nodded just once. "Good." He turned to leave. At the flap, he paused. "Come to the ridge tomorrow. If you're going to survive the next storm, you'll need more than anger." And then he was gone. Charlotte sat back down, her hands shaking just slightly. Behind her, Jane whispered, "Do you trust him?" Charlotte didn't answer for a long time. Then finally, "I don't know, but I trust the fire more than the cold." And outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the village in white silence. But inside, something was starting to thaw. The ridge was higher than it looked from the village, a steep climb that left Charlotte's lungs aching and her fingers stiff with cold. But she didn't slow. Chayton waited at the top, standing motionless beside a crooked pine, his bow slung over his shoulder. "You came," he said, not surprised, just acknowledging. Charlotte steadied her breath. "You said if I wanted to survive, I needed more than anger." Chayton nodded and handed her a bow. It was beautifully crafted, polished wood, smooth and firm, with sinew strung tight across its curve. It felt heavier than she expected, but not unwieldy, like it had been waiting for someone who meant to use it. "Ever shoot?" he asked. "Only once. My father let me loose an arrow at a target when I was 9. I missed." He laughed. Chayton's expression didn't change. "Don't aim to impress, aim to hit." He moved behind her, guiding her stance, shoulders squared, feet grounded. His hands were warm against hers, his voice quiet but clear. "Draw, breathe. Let the tension speak before you release." Charlotte did as told, drawing the bowstring back until it trembled. The wind brushed her face, cold and clean. Then she let go. The arrow flew wide, spinning off into the snow with a dull thunk. Again, Chayton said. She retrieved another and knocked it. This time it struck the edge of the tree they used as a target. Not a bullseye, but not a failure. They stayed until the sun dipped low behind the ridge. Her arms ached, her fingers numb. But the weight in her chest had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it had settled, focused. As they descended back toward the village, Chayton broke the silence. There's strength in remembering pain, but survival is choosing to live with it, not beneath it. Charlotte didn't respond, but she carried the words with her long after the fire had burned low that night. The next morning brought news. Riders had been spotted near the western hills. White men, 3, armed. They're searching, White Fawn said, her tone calm but grim. Jane paled. Do you think they're looking for us? No, Charlotte said. They're looking to erase us. She gathered the others by the fire outside their lodge. Smoke curled upward, catching the morning sun in the streaks of gold and gray. They sat close, shoulders brushing, the quiet between them thicker than snow. We can't hide forever, Charlotte said. They'll find us sooner or later. Mary looked up, eyes wide. Then what do? We don't run, Maggie answered before Charlotte could. We make sure they know we're not the same women they buried. Sarah clutched her blanket tighter. But we're not ready. We weren't ready to be left in the snow either, Lorna said, voice shaking. But here we are. Charlotte turned to Chayton, who stood silently at the edge of their circle. If they come, do we fight? You fight, he said, only when there's no other choice. He looked to Charlotte. But I don't think you're asking if you should fight. I think you're asking if it will matter. Charlotte met his gaze. Will it? He shrugged. If it doesn't matter to them, make it matter to you. That night, the women stayed awake long after the village fell quiet. They sharpened what blades they had. They practiced with bows, guided by Lakota warriors who'd seen too many winters to be careless. Jane learned to move silently, her feet brushing across the earth like wind through grass. Maggie wrapped cloth around the hilt of a broken hatchet, making it usable again. Even Sarah, quiet and bruised, began to carry herself differently. As the fire crackled low and the moon bathed the camp in silver, Charlotte sat alone at the edge of the trees. Chayton joined her, wordless as always. They'll come, she said. Yes, and when they do. Chayton pulled a long knife from his belt and drove it into the frozen ground between them. They'll find something they didn't leave behind. He looked to her, eyes dark and unwavering. They'll find fire. And Charlotte, exhausted but alive, nodded once, because she was no longer just trying to survive. She was preparing to rise. The sun was barely a rumor behind the low clouds when the riders came. 3 of them, just as White Fawn had said, coats flapping behind them like the wings of vultures, guns across their backs. One wore a hat Charlotte recognized, torn at the brim, stained with blood. Her stomach turned. They didn't ride fast. They didn't need to. Predators don't rush when they think their prey has nowhere left to run. Charlotte stood at the edge of the Lakota camp, flanked by Maggie and Lorna. Her fingers curled around the bow at her side, her shoulders straight even though her knees threatened to give. The rest of the village moved like shadows behind them. Warriors melted into the tree line. Women pulled children into lodges. The fire in Charlotte's chest burned slow and steady. The riders stopped 100 yards out. Their leader, a man with gray in his beard and cruelty in his eyes, leaned forward in the saddle. Well, he called, guess the wilderness ain't as unforgiving as we thought. Charlotte didn't flinch. Maybe it just decided who deserved to live. The man chuckled, amused. Look at you, all cleaned up, playing savage. Maggie stepped forward. You left us to die. He shrugged. That's what you were doing. We just gave the prairie a head start. Lorna's voice rang out, clear and hard. Then why are you here? That gave him pause. He shifted in the saddle, scanned the tree line. One of his companions, a younger man with a twitching eye and nervous hands, whispered something. The leader spat into the dirt. We're here for what's ours. Charlotte's voice was iron. There's nothing here that belongs to you. He smiled then, ugly. You don't get to say what's yours, girl. Not anymore. Behind her, the brush stirred. Chayton stepped into the open. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The way he moved, deliberate, calm, dangerous, said enough. The leader's smile faltered. That one of your new friends? Charlotte raised the bow, arrow knocked. He's the one who didn't leave me to die. The air thickened. The wind quieted, holding its breath. Then the man reached for his gun. Charlotte loosed the arrow before his hand touched the grip. It hit his shoulder, spinning him backward off his horse, and chaos erupted. The younger rider fired wildly, bullets snapping past Charlotte's head. Maggie tackled him to the ground with a scream, her fists flying. The third tried to turn and flee, but an arrow from the tree line struck his horse's flank. The beast bucked, throwing him. Chayton moved like lightning. He was on the man before he hit the snow, knocking the gun from his hand and pressing a blade to his throat. The first rider groaned, trying to crawl. Charlotte walked to him, her breath fogging in the air. She planted a foot on his chest. You want to finish what you started? She asked. He looked up at her, eyes wild. You think this means something? Charlotte leaned down. It does to me. And she turned away. Behind her, the Lakota emerged from the trees, silent and watchful. There was no need for more blood. The message had been delivered. That night, the fire burned hotter than any before. The village gathered, not to celebrate violence, but to mark the turning. The women sat together near the flames. Maggie's knuckles were scraped raw. Lorna's hair was loose, tangled by wind and fury. Jane smiled for the first time in weeks. Sarah sat beside White Fawn, who gently traced healing paste across the cuts on her arms. Charlotte stood with Chayton, staring into the fire. They'll come again, he said. She nodded. And next time, he met her gaze. You won't need us. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her coat and pulled out the eagle charm he'd once given her. She tied it to her bowstring, letting it rest against the wood. I think I was meant to break, she said quietly. But you didn't, he replied, and neither did the others. They weren't just survivors now. They were a warning. The days that followed passed with a new stillness. Not peace exactly, but something close. The kind of calm that settles after a storm when the ground is soaked with the memory of thunder. Charlotte found herself rising before dawn now, walking the perimeter of the camp with her bow slung across her shoulder. Not because she expected an attack, but because it felt right, because her heart beat differently now, heavier, stronger. The others changed too. Maggie spent her mornings helping the younger Lakota boys practice hand-to-hand fighting, barking commands with a dry grin that made even the most stubborn listen. Lorna traded her fear for purpose. She weaved hides, mended leather, and taught some of the Lakota girls old settler songs with voices so sweet they made the air hum. Sarah took to healing, working closely with White Fawn. Her hands, once clumsy from pain, now moved with care, intent. She didn't cry anymore. And Jane, quiet Jane, had become a watchful protector of the little ones. A gentle shadow who always made sure the fire was burning, the food was warm, the blankets were dry. They were building something. Not just shelter, but a way forward. Charlotte didn't talk about the men who had cast them out. No one did. It was like their names had been buried beneath the snow they were supposed to die in. But she remembered. Every time she strung her bow, every time her fingers closed around the shaft of an arrow, she remembered how close she'd come to becoming a ghost. And every time she looked around at the women, her sisters by survival, she remembered why she was still here. One evening, as twilight turned the sky lavender, Chayton approached her near the river. You still look south when you think no one's watching, he said. Charlotte kept her eyes on the water. That doesn't mean I want to go back. Doesn't mean you don't either. She turned to him. What are you saying? I'm saying some ghosts need burying, and some need facing. He crouched beside her, the scent of pine clinging to his coat. We hear talk. A preacher rides from town to town claiming a miracle. Says women died in the snow and came back wrong. Charlotte's jaw tightened. He paints you as witches, Chayton said. Says the land cursed you, that men are not to shelter you. Charlotte looked away, her breath sharp. Cowards can't stand what they can't control? Chayton didn't argue. But if you let that lie grow, it becomes truth. She nodded slowly, her voice flat. Then we burn it down. That night she called the women to the fire. The wind had teeth, but the flames warmed their faces as they sat in a circle, silence stretching wide. I want to go back, Charlotte said. Not because I miss that place. Not because they deserve to see us, but because they think we're gone. Maggie looked up, her eyes hard. So we let them know we're not. Lorna frowned. And what if they try again? We're not the same women, Jane said quietly. Let them try. Sarah's voice came soft but firm. We don't go back for them. We go back for every girl they'll leave next. Charlotte looked around the circle. We ride at first light. No one said no, and so they prepared. The Lakota warriors who stood with them before stood again, quiet and ready. Chayton brought fresh arrows. White Fawn packed salves and herbs. The horses were saddled, the trail marked. This time they didn't ride like prey. They rode like the reckoning. The frost hadn't yet lifted when they crested the ridge overlooking the town. From up high, it looked smaller than Charlotte remembered. Less like the seat of judgment, and more like a cluster of broken promises held together by fear. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. The church bell stood silent. A rooster crowed in the distance, unaware that justice rode on the wind. Maggie tightened the strap on her rifle. They won't be expecting us. They never did, Charlotte murmured. Beside her, Chayton shifted in his saddle, his expression unreadable. If you want me to ride in with you... No, Charlotte said firmly. They need to see us. Just us. He nodded once and pulled back his horse, the other Lakota riders halting behind him like a line of shadows guarding their backs. Charlotte led the way down the trail, flanked by the women who had once been tossed out like refuse. Now they moved like wolves, scarred, silent, united. They entered town at a trot, not hiding, not hesitating. The townsfolk froze. A man dropped his pail. A woman screamed. A young boy rubbed his eyes in disbelief. Then doors slammed shut and whispers slithered between window cracks. Charlotte dismounted first. Her boots hit the dirt with a thud that echoed down the street. One by one, the others followed. No one spoke, until a voice cracked through the tension like a whip. Witchcraft! The town preacher stood at the edge of the square, flanked by two men with hunting rifles and fear in their eyes. He wore his collar like a noose and held his Bible with a grip tighter than salvation. You were dead, he shouted. We buried you. No, Charlotte said, stepping forward. You left us to die. The preacher's face twisted. Your abominations, returned with fire in your eyes and heathens at your backs. Lorna's voice rang out like a bell. We returned because the land knew better than you. The townsfolk started to gather, drawn by the spectacle. Gasps, curses, prayers whispered behind trembling hands. We came back, Maggie growled, because you all need to see what truth looks like. The sheriff pushed through the crowd, his hand resting uneasily on his holster. This town don't want trouble, he said, voice shaking. You've made your point. Now go. Charlotte's gaze pinned him. We're not here for vengeance. She raised her voice, letting it carry over the rooftops into every corner of the town that once turned its back on them. We're here because someone needs to say it out loud. You don't get to decide who lives or dies. You don't get to leave women in the snow and sleep easy at night. Rose stepped forward, fire flashing in her eyes. You want to talk sin, preacher? What about the lies you told to save your own skin? Sarah pulled back her hood, revealing her scarred face. What about the girls you'll leave next time? Just like you did us. Jane walked to the center of the square and sat down, cross-legged, hands resting on her knees. We're not leaving, she said. The preacher's lip curled. Then we'll make you. But no one moved, because just then the wind shifted, and from the ridge came the soft rumble of hooves. The Lakota riders stood tall, silent as stone, watching. Their presence spoke louder than any threat. The town went quiet. The sheriff slowly lowered his hand from his gun. The preacher's rage withered in his throat. Charlotte let the silence stretch. Then she turned, mounted her horse again, and with the others behind her began to ride. Not out of fear, but through it. They didn't need to burn the town down. They didn't need to take anything back. They had already won. They made camp that night beneath the stars, miles from the place that had tried to erase them. The fire cracked and popped, casting flickering shadows across tired but unbowed faces. Chayton sat beside Charlotte, his voice low. You burned them clean without lifting a weapon. Charlotte stirred the fire with the tip of a stick. They needed to see who we became. He nodded. And who is that? She looked at the others, Maggie laughing as she showed Sarah how to carve a new grip on her blade, Jane humming softly while stitching a new blanket. Lorna sharpening arrowheads with a steady hand, Rose leaning against a tree, eyes watching the stars like they were old friends. Charlotte smiled faintly. Legends! And the fire whispered its agreement, crackling with the promise that their story wouldn't be buried again. Not now. Not ever. Not while the winds still carried their names.